Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all are having a fantastic morning, just like because we are right here at the Gasification India Day 2 Waste to Energy technical sessions. Had a fantastic day yesterday, a lot of learnings, and today we have some eminent speakers joining in to give us their bit on how to solve the problems that the world needs solved. Panel discussion will be about carbon capture utilization and storage support future of waste to energy projects. It's truly an honor to invite the moderator for the session, Mr. Ramesh Bujhare, Carbon Management Specialist. He'll be taking care of the conversation going from here. It's also a pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Prerna Soni, Vice President in West India. Thank you so much for joining in, ma'am. Mr. V. Pradeep Indrakhanti, Energy Consultant, Leonardo Technologies Inc., is also joining us. Welcome, sir. I would also like to welcome Madhura Mitra, Director, Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory, Prince Waterhouse Coopers Private Limited. Thank you so much, ma'am. I'll let our moderator for the session, Mr. Bujhare, to take this conversation forward. We have an hour for this, and I'm absolutely sure that all of you listening to this conversation will have a great time.
Thank you, Ravinji. And it's my pleasure to be part of this particular conference. And our esteemed panelists, thank you very much for joining this session. And topic, as you know, is CCU, future of waste to energy. It's a very relevant topic in today's context. There is a talk of climate change, 1.5 degrees C, 2 degrees C. And in that sense, CCUS is recognized as one of the basically pathway for net zero. Waste to energy historically, as we know, was about converting waste to energy while we take care of waste generation. But many of the processes produce CO2, and CO2 being the greenhouse gas leading to the global warming, there is a need to take care of that CO2 also. So in fact, CO2 is also waste in that context. So we have got esteemed panel. We would be covering different topics. In all these waste to energy projects or CCUs, the main concern is about the cost. There are technologies, new technologies coming up, but then the bottleneck remains basically the cost. So our panelists will cover both technical as well as commercial parts, and what are the constraints, what are the barriers for commercialization of new technologies, what are the barriers for the existing plants which have been there installed. Some of them are working, some of them are not working, and the scenario worldwide uh, is different. What is true for developed economies may not be applicable in the Indian context, because the waste is different, amount is different, geography is different. So to begin with, we have got the panelist. Ms. Madhuraji, would you be starting, and may I request you to give your views on that, and what is the status of the plants in India, in world? Over to you, madam.
Yeah, thank you, Ramesh ji. I hope I'm audible to all of you. So if you can hear me, then I'll start.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yes, very pertinent points you raised, in your introduction. I just wanted to highlight a few things and some cliched information also I would like to repeat. One is that our West sector actually emits 3% of the total greenhouse gases that India emits. That is as per the latest biennial report that we have. So that's a very important point for us to remember, because if we can avoid emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 and others from the waste sector through waste to energy or waste to value, and then can capture the remaining, carbon through either utilization or storage of carbon, then we can get rid of this 3% emissions that are coming, which is a huge number, if we absolute value. Also, some more statistics I would like to share. That is around 60 million tons of waste, gets disposed every year in the landfill for India. That results almost into around 1 million tons of methane. And methane, as you all know, that it is a very, very potent greenhouse gas, almost 24 times of carbon dioxide. So if we can convert this methane to CO2 and then use that and capture that, that would be a very, that will be a significant contribution to all the national goals that we have around Paris Agreement or the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal or well below 2 degrees Celsius goal. So it's very important for us to capture the waste that is coming out of landfill to see that we can avoid any waste related emissions, be it methane or CO2. And then we'll have to see how the remaining CO2 that is coming out of a flue gas chamber or wherever, how we can then capture that as well. So now the question is, in India, if we look at the historical figures, we will see that both waste to energy and carbon capture both have been practiced, especially waste to energy. This particular initiative has been practiced historically in a very, very significant manner. And if I just give you some more statistics, you will know that under the Kyoto Protocol, just before Paris Agreement, we completed the Kyoto Protocol regime. Around 84 projects got registered under the Clean Development Mechanism of Kyoto Protocol. And we traded carbon credit, through waste to energy projects. And there were 84 projects, and that led to around 64 million tons of CO2 avoidance just from waste to energy. So waste to energy projects, and it doesn't always involve waste to, waste pressure to energy, waste heat to energy, and in certain cases, all the emissions that happened in the handling of waste, we try to convert that to energy. So combining all that, it is somewhere around 64 million tons of CO2 that we avoided from these projects. So waste to energy is not something very new for the country. We have already practiced that. Our industries have already implemented several projects. But there is the next step would be to combine CCUS to that waste to energy initiative that is already there in our country. And if I talk about CCUS also, some very significant, again, I'm talking about waste to energy separately and CCUS separately. If I do that, then there are quite a few good examples in our country. For example, if you look at Hindustan Zinc Limited, and it has come out in their last TCFD report. In their 2050 vision, they are saying all the off gases that are coming out from their processes, they will capture 100% of that. 50% will be converted to concrete, and 50% will be converted to soil carbon. That is a very, very important point to note, because the moment you convert the CO2 into soil carbon, you are creating a long-term carbon sink, and you are enhancing the fertility of the soil, which in turn will help in the agricultural productivity and plantations as well. So this is a very long-term, forward-looking process to capture in the soil, all the carbon that we are trying to capture, and then try and see how we can create a long-term carbon sink, long-term carbon capture. That way, it will actually lead to our overall net zero goal as a country. We have committed by 2070 will become net zero. So that it helps there. So the point that I'm trying to make is we have already made progress in terms of waste to energy. We are trying to do CCUS. Tata Steel has already declared, as you know, 5 tons per day of carbon capture. And then other plants are also looking at somewhere around 10 tons per day of this carbon capture. So there are progresses happening. Now we need to converge waste to energy and carbon together. That is the next step, and that is what we are trying to talk about today. And as Ramesh, you highlighted, there are of course certain challenges around that. And the challenge, of course, is not only cost is, of course, one of them. If we look at certain CCUS mechanisms, then it is somewhere around, $800 per ton of CO2. If I just look at the abatement cost, so it's a huge amount. But it is not only about cost. I just mentioned that around 84 projects led to 64 million tons of CO2 abatement. But if you look at the overall country requirement, that is a minuscule amount. 60 million ton would be a minuscule amount for us. So it's very important for us to understand that till now, waste to energy projects that happened in India, capacities have been, or the implementation has been in a modular fashion. And the capacity would be somewhere around say 15 megawatt, maximum 20 megawatt. So the question is, and it started from say 4 megawatt, 3 megawatt, 5 megawatt. This is the range. So how do we scale it up? We need to scale it up because under NDC or net zero, the target is much higher. So we need to look at scaling up these waste to energy projects at a slightly higher capacity. One of the plants I'm
Yeah.
working at, they need 125 megawatt, for example, from west. How do we do that? So Rameshji, I'll stop here, and maybe other speakers can come in now to discuss a little more on this, and then I'll go to the other challenges and opportunities if you give me time. So,
Absolutely.
uh,
And you
yeah,
made very, very relevant point, Madhuraji, that Hindustan Zinc, their plan is to convert CO2, which is generated into concrete and then the soil amendment carbon. So, in effectively, you are locking up the carbon, which can be remain locked up for hundreds of years, and that is what carbon negative is. So,
right.
in fact, recently also I was associated with Asian Development Bank, and cement industry, as you know, is the hard to abate CO2 industry, and carbon utilization and storage has gained the importance to that. Now there are technologies, many technologies which are already established, which have got the advanced TRL. Some of the technologies are under development. Uh, I would request Dr. Pradeep Indrakanti to touch upon the technologies available, what is the status of those technologies, and give us some glimpses of the technologies on that. Dr. Pradeep?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rameshji and Madhuraji, for your introduction. You both have touched upon um, a few things that I had in mind. And just to continue from where Rameshji stopped, right? It's we are going from a waste paradigm to a win-win paradigm. Can you see this slides all right?
Sure, yes, yes.
Okay. So so there are examples of waste to energy plants uh, in the European Union where they're capturing CO2 and sequestering this CO2, storing this CO2 in saline formations. There is this plant called Klimatsrud in Oslo, Norway, where they are capturing zero point 0.4 million metric tons of CO2, and they're transporting the CO2 by ship and storing it in the North Sea. As the speakers here well know, and the audience also is fully aware, in they have where places which have good waste segregation, lower moisture content, higher lower organic content, and higher calorific value in the waste stream, right? They have better economics for converting this waste to energy. And this sort of thing may not be applicable right away in the Indian context. Currently, WTE plants in India, as Ramesh was saying, some are running well, some have issues, right? The power prices are higher, and they have these pollution issues associated with them. And carbon capture can help with that. If you can capture CO2 from the waste stream, from the flue gas stream, you can also reduce the emissions of SOx, NOx, and the other, hazardous air pollutants. But right away, you cannot it's not a bolt-on technology for the current Indian waste to energy plants, because it's energy intensive, and energy is a premium quantity. And in the US context, there is policy support in the form of 45Q tax credits. It's essentially a production tax credit, right? If you store or use CO2, either for EOR or for saline storage, you can get a tax credit. And EU has other mechanisms in terms of policy support, also from the EU emissions trading scheme. And those prices are quite high, actually. It's north of, I last checked them a few months ago, and it was pretty high. And coming to the Indian context, so we need to think about it slightly differently, maybe out of the box. And one thing that comes to my mind is, looking at the compressed biogas context in terms of the Satat scheme, where we are planning to produce 15 million metric tons of compressed biogas. And essentially, these are small plants, but as Rameshji was pointing out, the Tata Steel, the pilots that are coming up, they're in the 5s and 10s of tons per day. And these plants would capture about that much. Basically, this CO2 capture is needed on the biogas streams, because this compressed biogas has to meet the IS 16087 specification, where the percentage of CO2 in the biogas is limited to 4%. The raw biogas has 38% CO2, roughly, depending on the source, 40%. So in this context, I just want to mention that carbon capture, the Carbon Clean Solutions Limited and the Gas Authority of India Limited have this memorandum of understanding, where they're trying to set up 4 compressed biogas plants. CCSL is a carbon capture technology development company. And for them to be involved in GALE indicates that there is this interest in this capture of CO2 from biogas streams. Again, the scales are limited here, but this has potential because it's a readily available stream, and it can be easily separated. You just need a membrane or some other easy things to separate it. Gasifiers, on the other hand, the scales are slightly larger. So, for example, the waste to energy plant I was talking about in Norway, it captures about a little over 1,000 tons of CO2 per day. So, depending on the scale of the, if you gasify a municipal sewage, a municipal solid waste stream, you're capturing maybe hundreds to thousands of tons of CO2 per day. So that kinds of puts you where you want to go in terms of using the CO2 or storing the CO2. I can maybe stop here, or I can continue if you want me to.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Pradeep. You have also touched a very relevant subject like CBG, and it's a relatively mature technology. As far as the power generation is concerned, or the electricity is concerned, there are other ways. For example, solar energy. It has got also the some limitations with respect to storage and non-availability 24/7. And at this stage, basically the storage cost is very significant. Best way for the waste to energy plants is to avoid CO2 formation. Now, for example, our main theme of this particular conference is gasification and the coal gasification in that. But we are taking out the coal from inside the earth and then putting back CO2 into the atmosphere, which is leading to the global warming. Now, what about the carbon, which is already available above the earth, biomass or food waste or any kind of waste which has got a carbon? So, though we are talking about decarbonization of energy sector, it's not possible to decarbonize as far as the chemical industry is concerned. We do need carbon. We do need carbon in the in chemicals, biochemicals, plastics. So carbon is going to be the source, and if it comes from the renewable feedstock like biomass, or MSW organics or single-use plastics. So there are technologies which are being developed. Uh, a lot of investment has been done at lab scale, pilot plant scale, and even demo scales. But still, the barrier remains, and that is the technical viability. Though in terms of LCA, life cycle analysis, it shows that it does reduce the carbon footprint, but the investment is a bottleneck. And in that context, I think Prerna Soniji would be throwing some light on that particularly. She's from Investment India and the right person to talk about that. So please, Prerna.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rameshji. So, of course, I'm not a technical expert in this particular area, but I do understand investments, and I understand that in the end of the day, when we're talking about money coming into any sector, or when we're talking about profitability of any sector, which is how you enhance growth, economies of scale really matter. Your unit economics really matter. And when I look at the entire energy ecosystem in India, and as a matter of fact globally, I think one thing which is very interesting is the learnings that we can get from sectors such as renewable energy. You did refer to solar, and we've seen the kind of costing that the world was noticing, especially for solar energy. There was a time when we it was not competitive with traditional energy, while the technology was there, while there were aspects of solar energy which were working. However, overall, in the scheme of things, it was not a viable and a competitive source of energy. The reason it became competitive, one was with technological advancements, and second, economies of scale that could be brought into place. When we talk about CCS as a matter of fact, and we look at how global budgets are playing in, Pradeep also mentioned Norway's been doing a lot of work. UK has put in $1 billion and plus for as a budget. US and Canada. But if we drill down, we'll realize that a lot of work has actually happened in US and Canada, and Norway and UK actually cancelled a lot of these projects. China right now, along with ADB, as you mentioned, has done a lot of these projects very recently, considering the amount of carbon waste. But when we put it in the Indian perspective, I think one has to also highlight and reflect on the fact that a lot of these carbon emissions, especially from the perspective of CCS, come into play from industrialization. When India is moving towards that 5 trillion economy, when India is saying that we will have more than 25% of our GDP coming from manufacturing, that means our carbon emissions are only going to increase. We are talking about our commitments to the Paris Agreement, but the fact that we are moving towards achieving it. On the other side, we will see an increase in manufacturing. Hence, there is going to be more and more carbon emissions in the country. So the one way where we can approach a lot of this can be actually going the renewable way. How we started there was through viability gap fundings that the government was providing. The other aspect was trunk infrastructure, which was being provided by the government. In fact, even today, trunk infrastructure is being made available by the government. So, if we talk about something like CCS, integrated clusters of industries should have the entire trunk infrastructure available for compression of CO2, for pipelines to be able to move all of this CO2 together in one go. You know, things like ISO containers. India was not using ISO containers till now, but now we are saying we can use them for LNG, we can use them for oxygen movement. Probably time to see to get regulations in place for using ISO containers for compressed CO2 emissions as well. Long story short, I think the aspect of providing viability gap funding, till the time technologies make this ecosystem viable on its own to be able to manage without government support, and costings come down with economies of scale, is certainly one way to go.
Rightly said, Prernaji, this VGF, viability gas funding, is definitely essential to promote or take the technology forward. But ultimately, it's the inherent technical viability of the project which is definitely important in the long run. And definitely, and there is something called valley of death, and I have experienced personally in my development career. In fact, I was uh, with Reliance till last year, and we have developed the technology which is supposed to be very good. And there are many technologies. So, for example, MSW organics, conventional technologies are incineration technology, pyrolysis, and all, but they need drying of the waste. And in Indian context, the MSW organics have got lot of water. If you compare the MSW in developed countries or rich countries, then the content of moisture is much less. So unfortunately or fortunately, whatever, but nature of waste also depends on the whether the country is developing or whether this company developed. And another thing is that with the online shopping, and particularly after pandemic, we have been using online shopping extensively. And you will see for small, even USB, if I order, I will get the big packaging. So this has resulted in the more waste and different kind of waste. So there are technologies, and even though technical viability is definitely established, the investment is not coming because the uh, investors or the private industries, they are investing in the laboratory scale because the investment is low. They will also commit to take it to the demo scale, but from demo scale to commercial scale there is a big jump, and naturally the investment also is very high. uh, if it takes off, then there is no limit. I mean, all the startups are like that. But the startups of in the information technology are different than the chemical industry startups, as you know. So it's called the value of death, and if we overcome that, basically, then there are technologies which can be taken off. I am seeing Dr. Kasba is not there on the panel, and he was supposed to give his views on practical considerations, what is going on the ground level. I think he is not there. Audience, I will request you to post your questions. We can take those questions after second round of our discussions from our panelists. But please feel free to express your views, and please put up your questions so that we make this discussion most fruitful and engaging and compelling. Now, having said that, Pradeep, would you like to touch upon technologies which are at the scale, which are waiting for to be commercialized, and how it helps basically the waste to energy or waste to wealth? I would say, I won't say waste to energy, because there are energy options. What we don't have the options is the waste to chemicals.
Right.
So I would suggest that if you can touch upon those topics, it would be most useful.
Sure, sure. Thank you. So continuing where I left off, thank you, Prernaji, for bringing up the point about capacity building. It's a really big the Northern Lights project that I was talking about in the EU. It's an exercise in that trunk infrastructure. They are bringing CO2 from different streams, different industries, and they're sequestering it in one location. Um, and that is kind of is a segue to where we can store the. Let me touch upon where we can store the CO2, and then I will go on to where we can what technologies we have to convert the CO2. So there are several sedimentary basins as well as basalt formations, the Deccan Traps, for example, where you can store and or convert the CO2. Some of the ones highlighted here in the upper right corner, the Assam Shelf, the Krishna Godavari Basin, the Kaveri Basin, and the Assam Arakan Fold Belt. These are basins which have very high CO2 storage potential and also high storage feasibility in terms of existing oil and gas infrastructure, in terms of access to pipeline networks, and so on. And obviously, EOR has been CO2 EOR. I mean, the injection of CO2 to produce to increase the oil production from depleted oil and gas formations. It is a commercial technology. It has been practiced very heavily in the US. There are some pilot tests that are happening, and IOCL is planning a few things. But it has yet to take off in the Indian context. So I see this as like a longer term, maybe 5-10 years down the line, a play where you can identify, characterize all the relevant reservoir formations, and as Prernaji pointed out, build up this capacity to capture the CO2, capacity to transport the CO2, and capacity to store the CO2, and capacity to monitor the CO2 so that whatever is injected does not leak out. Right. So all these things need to go into place before a viable CC carbon capture and storage deployment can happen. In the near term, on the other hand, there are solutions where you can convert CO2 and hydrogen, for example, or syngas, which contains carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, to biofuel. We have heard talks from Mr. Ramakrishna yesterday and Mr. Jain from Lanzatech, where there are these technologies that convert CO2 to biofuels, for example. Using electricity, they are converting CO2 to carbon monoxide and carbon monoxide to ethanol, and ethanol to petrol, gasoline. And there are companies such as startups such as Nova Nutrients, where they're using CO2 and electricity and producing nutrients or protein feed for basically fish feed. And there are other startups which are tweaking with bacteria. So they're changing, they're genetically modifying the bacteria to produce building blocks. I call it like building the building blocks. So the building block chemicals which can be further used in downstream petrochemical industries. All of this, and as Mr. Ramesh mentioned earlier, right? So when you have technologies such as HTL, where you can bring in the biomass which already contains CO2. If you have an algae pond, right? It has the CO2, it captured the CO2 already. You take this biomass and have a HTL system, and you can produce a biofuel. And you can embody the biofuel embody the carbon that is present in the biofuel. So all these things play a role. Some are near term, some are longer term, but this is a very exciting field to be in, I would say, at this time.
Thank you, Pradeep. You touched upon again very relevant topics about chemicals and from CO2. Now, the crux of the whole thing is the hydrogen and electricity. And unless it comes from renewable source, from energy balance point of view, definitely it's negative. If you say hydrogen for the energy point of view, but hydrogen becomes a facilitator for converting any carbon or CO2 to useful products. Uh, you have touched upon algae, how to convert CO2, atmospheric CO2 to biomass. There's already biomass available in terms of waste. So this is in fact called bioenergy CCUS, and it is an energy negative pathway. So you take out CO2 from atmosphere or the point sources, grow biomass, convert it into basically the drop-in fuel. Because if you convert into fuel or something fuel gas, probably there are some limitations. But if you convert this biomass into the bio crude, which is fungible in the sense it can be co-processed in the same infrastructure, then it is the right approach. For example, sustainable aviation fuel. We have been talking about electricity from solar, but as I said earlier, the battery is an option, and years to come, aviation industry is unlikely to have any alternate source other than the liquid fuel. Small aeroplanes or short range aeroplanes, probably they will have hydrogen sourced energy or even the batteries. But it is the long haul and high capacity aeroplanes, over 1,000 kilometer flight, which contribute significant amount of CO2 to global warming. And there is only option available is only sustainable aviation fuel as a liquid fuel. So algal oil plays very, very important role. Similarly, converting biomass to syngas as a building block, as you said correctly, and then taking forward it to the various chemicals which are sustainable. So, audience, as you must have seen, that CCUS is definitely facilitator and supplementary technology for bioengineering. And bioengineering CCUS, where you can lock carbon in terms of biochar. In fact, again, I would like to mention here the gasification conference going on parallelly. If you can replace this coal by the biocoal, and there are ways, for example, hydrothermal carbonization. What it does basically convert biomass into the coal, and which can be replacing the coal traditional way in the equipment. So you don't have to invest into the infrastructure, new infrastructure. And as a result, we will not be taking out carbon in the form of coal from inside the earth, but we are converting. But then the problem is it's not available at one place. We may feel that there is a lot of biomass available, a lot of waste is available, but logistics may not facilitate implementation in reality. So availability of the feedstock at right cost is important. And in that context, I would request Madhuraji to say a few words and share her views.
Yeah, as I was mentioning, Rameshji, in the beginning also, availability of feedstock is one of the challenges that the industries are facing. And where I stopped, I was trying to say that I mean, so far we have seen, say, plants up to say 15 megawatt maximum, or say 20 megawatt. But if we have to expand this, because we are talking about a net zero future, we are talking about some 33% emissions intensity reduction, which is a huge absolute value. And if that has to happen, I'm currently working with a plant with one of the manufacturing industries. So they are looking for a round the clock. They need, because they are manufacturing, they need round the clock energy, and that too say around 120 megawatt. Their capacity will be somewhere around 120 megawatt. So now to have waste feedstock, talk about biomass only. If they need biomass feedstock, that is also more than 1,000 tons per day. They will need feedstock at a minimum. I'm just giving you a ballpark figure, but that biomass is not available. How to make sure that there is a supply chain to make 1,000 tons per day available every day for them, and that also has a consistent calorific value, because they will finally, it's a cogen plant where they will both use power and steam. How do we make this available is a question that we are facing everywhere. That is question number one. So how do we scale it up? And if we have to scale it up, how do we kind of ensure the supply chain? One is, of course, look at all the biomass vendors, congregate them, and do that. The other way, which we, I mean, as you know, the PricewaterhouseCoopers is a consulting firm, is an advisory firm. What we are trying to advise is, why can't we balance this out with a large scale plantations program? By plantations program, I mean both land plantations, plantations on land, and plantations in water. You talked about algae based energy generation, and we have a very long sea, a coastal line and all. So if we can go for, say, and there are plants which are nearer to the sea, nearer to the coastal line. If they can make use of sea, because we have water in abundant units. how so their algae-based production becomes very, very important. But there also one of the challenges that we are facing is the moisture content in algae, and how we can get rid of the moisture content and then finally get the gross or the net calorific value based on the dry weight. So all these questions are coming. So one of the solutions that we are looking at is wherever there is a large scale requirement of feedstock, instead of depending on a supply chain which is uncertain in nature, how we can club that with a large scale plantations program, because that way you can create that negative pathway of carbon, you sink carbon first and then use it you know in an infrastructure where you do not need much retrofit and much changes. Because when we go for say pellets and all, and they all these are coal based power plants I'm talking about, you need minimal changes there. So how we can make use of that? And then when you capture carbon, when we capture carbon after we generate the energy, if there are modular solutions to capture the carbon, if there are modular solutions to, it may be in the flue gas chamber. I have heard of technology, and Pradeep, you might want to throw some light on that. Modular technologies of carbon dissociation, and then you produce carbon black. I think I'm forgetting. You produce something which is again utilizable. So what I'm trying to say is that availability you ensure. I mean, instead of depending on a third party supply chain, go for plantations, and then so that you can create that negative balance of carbon. And second is, once the carbon comes out, CO2 comes out of flue gas chamber or wherever, how we can capture it in a manner so that we can utilize it. And so these businesses, if they can tie up with other businesses, if a chemical manufacturing plant can tie up with a cement manufacturing plant, then there is a supply chain. There is a win-win business case for them. So we are trying to strike such a balance wherever we are trying to advise our industries and clients. So I'll just stop here, Rameshji. Any thoughts around this? Yeah, you are on mute. I think you are on mute. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. You have just mentioned the point. There is a lot of water in the algae, right? And how to remove that
Correct.
water and make it process. Now
Yes.
that is conventionally what used to happen, because algae when it is grown, it has got more than 99% water. Imagine,
Hmm. Hmm.
okay, and it's like our body. In fact, we see as a person, but our body also has got almost 80% water.
Water.
Okay,
Yeah.
so algae behave the same manner. To achieve even 20% algae concentration is a challenge. So there are technologies which do not require removal of water. In fact, water is acting as a reactant, and that is what Pradeep had said. Hydrothermal liquefaction. This is the
Ah,
technology which doesn't require removal of water.
that's
Uh,
wonderful. Then that is needed in
so
the industries. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Hmm.
water is a reactant, and it's a natural process. Just to give the background of inside that how oil is formed, because there is a lot of temperature inside
Hmm.
there, a lot of pressure is there. So temperature and pressure convert biomass or whatever the residual things are there inside there into oil, gas, and coal. This
Yeah.
particular process is basically developed above the ground. It's a replica of the nature. And incidentally, I was associated with this technology for last
Yeah.
10 years.
Yeah.
We have got patents and all these things also. We can talk later on this subject.
Yes. Very
Okay.
interesting. Very, very interesting.
Sure, sure. So, so as I said, technologies and India, Europe, China, uh, there are technologies, but I don't know how we are at what say. China is very leading, uh, uh, but there are some technology leading companies. There are some laggards in the technology. I think Preranaji would be able to throw some light on the technology status and the investment, particularly how to combine that. Would you like to say, Prernaji, on that?
Sure. So when we start talking about technologies, so of course I'm not an expert on what are the technologies that can be really used here, but of course I can give some view on how investments can be brought in. I think a large part of how we, again, going back to the renewable energy story, the way we got technologies, a lot of our dependence at one point in time was on China. We were getting all of our panels from China, and that's when we started incentivizing manufacturing within the country. Similarly, I think when we're looking at this particular problem, there has to be one, a lot of R&D done within the country. The minute we start talking about investments that coming into this particular sector, of course, Ramesh, we've spoken about this, wherein the initial investments which are needed for pilot of the technology is still available, but the minute you have to scale it up and you have to make it something which is large scale, the amount of capital investment becomes significant, and that's where the challenge really comes in, considering even if we talk about the energy generation that comes from waste to wealth, it's not competitive with the rest of energy. So either there have to be ways in which there are more incentives given out by the government. There certainly has to be a tipping fees that needs to be brought into the entire ecosystem when we're talking about waste. There has to be some sort of a way to get more partnerships. So while and this is something that we've seen in sectors such as EVs, wherein there are certain technologies which are available. So, to give you an example, ISRO had a technology for battery manufacturing, which they were ready to give out to anybody who would want to set up a plant in the country. So the idea was to take a technology by way of a basic technology fee and make mass scale production possible. So, there are ways in which the government is also now trying to figure out ways to provide technologies to companies who can try and support. So, Pradeep spoke about a few technologies. If there is a way we can bring in the government ecosystem to support that, then there are examples of what the industry themselves are doing. We were talking about cement, and there's a classic example of what Dalmia Cement is trying to do. They've brought down their emissions down to 456 tons kilowatt hour as against the global standard of 900, and their focus is that by 2040 they would want to bring it to minus 40 kilowatt hour tons. And that is the kind of industry initiative. Madhura spoke about what Jindal is doing. These are some examples, but in the end of the day, while there is some aspect of CSR which gets involved, there is some aspect of their own industry awareness that comes in. But I think a lot of this can happen if we try and club it with the potential alpha generation. To give you an example, Pradeep would be aware there's a lot of ESG focus in all Scandinavian countries. They would not invest in anything which does not have an ESG component. We can try and bring that in a country like India, wherein either you have some sort of a carbon credit mechanism that comes into play. You have you can actually, there is an energy exchange that we have in the country. There is a coal cess that we have in the country. But in addition, if we can have some way wherein these emission credits can actually be traded between industrialists, that is where they can start building on their base to have enough incentives to go out and start investing in this space also, and to benefit from going green in the future.
Dalmia Cement that you mentioned. In fact, they are doing a fantastic job. Mahindra Singhi, the managing director, is basically leading the line. And I was fortunate to work with Dalmia Cements over the last 1 year. In fact, I presented to Dalmia Cement, and they're the absolutely leading in the whole industry. And cement industry kilns, basically, this particular industry differs from other industry. Unlike other industries, the energy is the one who emits CO2. But in cement industry, it's a process-centric CO2 emission. So that is why it's called a hard to abate cement industry. But at the same time, they are making maximum use of biomass in the kilns for process heating. Uh, in the construction industry also generates a lot of waste. And you must have heard of X Prize awards. Our Indian Dr. Sant is there, and Pradeep knows, I think, about it. They got the award for utilizing CO2 for cement construction, cement production. Also, how to use debris. So it's a one way of waste to wealth. And we have got around 8 minutes left out. I would request audience to please come out with your questions to the audience. We have got experts here who will definitely address. But all in all, the question of the topic is CCUS a future of waste to energy? Yes, I can, and all my panelists will agree that yes, that is the answer. So, Madhuraj, there is one question here. Impact of global warming through CO produced from WTE. I think that question is visible to you.
Yeah, I can say that. So I think you meant CO2. And do you want me to compare the CO2 emissions from landfill? And that's what I understand. CO2 emissions from landfill and WTE. So if I compare that, I mean,
It
if
should be
that,
CO2, I think, not CO.
yeah, not CO. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm sure it is CO2. And if you want me to compare, if that is the question, that what is CO2 from W2E versus CO2, if I convert methane to CO2 equivalent from landfill, I think that's the question. I'm assuming that's the question. So then it is almost the double. If I look at CO2 that is coming out from after waste to energy. If I look at a per ton of waste, if waste is the my source, primary source, so say zero point 0.5 ton of CO2 per ton of waste is what you get after from WTE. Whereas if you put it in the landfill, then it would be somewhere around 1 ton of CO2 per ton of waste. If I just do a comparison of landfill and waste to energy, in absence of CCUS, I'm talking about in absence of CCUS, it's almost the double if we put it in landfill, if we do not go for waste to energy. Yeah. There is.
So that is the, as we will wait for some more questions. Pradeep, would you like to share your uh, concluding remark on
Sure.
this particular? How do you look at it?
Yeah, yeah. And to echo your thoughts, Rameshji, it's definitely a win-win solution. And just to touch upon the what Prernaji said, incentives are definitely useful, right? Guarantee prices, floor prices, offtake contracts, both for in the context of CBG and also for CO2. Both are needed, right? Uh, it's not it becomes relevant, especially like India. Liquid fuels are at a premium compared to gaseous fuels. So if you can produce liquid fuels and CO2, that'd be useful. Um, and one thing that point that was brought about from the presentations yesterday was using all the byproducts from the process. For example, if you have biochar, how do you monetize the biochar? How, if you have CO2, how do you monetize CO2? If you have ethanol, obviously there's a market for it because there's 1G ethanol mandate for it. And one other thing is the external price of carbon and the internal price of carbon. And increasingly, I've spoken to a few biogas industry participants, and they have been in discussions with some of the PSUs and some of the other companies where they say, okay, we don't have an external price of carbon right now, but can you give us this for this much amount? So they have this internal price of carbon, and they're basing their judgments or their investing decisions based on that. So ultimately, the net zero concept, right? It filters down, it trickles down, but it'd be useful to have something, a pull as well as a push to make this go forward in terms of CCUS and WTE. I think,
Rightly said. Madhuraji, would you like, Dalviji would like to say something?
Uh, Sir, I think we had a question from one of our sponsors, Aman Gare. and that was well answered. I was wondering, Ravin sir, if you can check whether Mr. Ilango's question has been answered, and if you can invite him on stage. That's about it. Ravin sir?
Yes, Mr. Dalvi, the question has been answered, and I tried to invite Sir on the stage, but he denied that. So, oh, he's here now.
So
Okay, give me a second.
this is another question. I think utilization of biomass. This is the question.
Yes, this is a
Prakash,
question, sir, and I'll hand over the mic after this to Mr. Ilango to have a chat.
sure.
Mr. Bujade, who I would let you answer the question, or anybody in the panel would want to.
I can answer this question.
Please, sir.
So this will be the circular economy, in the sense biomass absorbs CO2 from atmosphere and then converts into biomass. And when you're utilizing in rotary kiln, ultimately it burns and again CO2 gets formed. But unlike fossil fuel, uh, this is a circular, it goes back again to the atmosphere and CO2. To that extent, reduction of CO2, uh, not per se negative, not net zero approach, but it's a circular economy approach. So we get the thermal energy, but we are replacing the fossil fuel by the biomass. And to that extent, I was presenting the slide there. So there is a not net reduction of CO2, but it's a reduction of the CO2. Hope I answered the question. So it's a second biomass without CCS. This is the carbon neutral approach. But to make it carbon negative, you have to utilize that CO2 and, for example, mineralization is one option where you can basically permanently store the CO2. Then it will become a reduction of the carbon. I hope I answered the questions. Soni, Prernaji, your concluding remark on this topic?
Sure. Thank you, Ramesh. I think one of the aspects is going to be more awareness about using CCUS. A lot of industries don't really understand the crucial impact that this can create on their industry as well as the entire ecosystem. So, more and more awareness within the Indian ecosystem is certainly necessary. In addition, I think we need to have more PPP models around this. So public-private partnerships need to happen, wherein, of course, the entire aspect of VGF, the entire aspect of incentives, tipping fee, offsets that we spoke about should be brought in. And the minute we see both alignments of the industry and the government happen, we will reach a scale wherein we will start seeing economies of scale, and the cost implications that have been challenging for this particular industry will start going down, making it more of a reality on a larger scale. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Madhuraji, you had started the discussion and you may like to conclude on the discussion.
Yes, Ramesh, I just wanted to conclude saying that there are a lot of possibilities around waste to energy plus CCS. Keeping in mind two key things, that renewable energy, when we talk about renewable energy, it only replaces electricity. I mean, electricity generated from uh, carbon-based fuels like fossil fuels. Of course, when it power can be replaced with renewable power, but steam requirement is also quite huge in our country. So to cater to the steam requirement, as I was telling you earlier also, we need fuels like that is coming out from west. It can be a biofuel or any other fuel coming out from west and cater to the steam demand of the country. And hence, this has a very, very important, market demand, which we must recognize. Second point I would like to highlight is that after the COP, the last COP that we had, we know that there will be an international carbon trading scheme again. Just like we had under the Kyoto Protocol, CDM, there will be one more carbon trading market, which will be available for Indian credits. So Waste to Energy plus CCUS projects will be definitely additional projects, and we will be definitely claiming carbon credits from these projects in the market, just as we did under Waste to Energy. And that will be one of the very important financing instruments for such projects. So I'm very hopeful that this will take a very, very concrete shape in the next 1 decade. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, organizers, for arranging this very timely topic. And I hope everyone got the answer. Yes, CCUS is the future of WTE. Uh, Over to you, Ravinji.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that brings us to the end of the first session, the technical one, and we're really happy for the conversation that happened here. A lot of valid points and a lot of insights into the future. So that's about it from the first session of the day two. I want to thank once again our presenters here. Firstly, the moderator, Mr. Ramesh Pujare, for conducting that wonderful, wonderful session. Of course, Mr. Pradeep Indrakhanti, thank you so much for being here. Prerna Soni ma'am, thank you so much. Madhura Mitra ma'am, thank you. We truly appreciate you being here and sharing what really makes the future going to be in the right direction. And waste to energy is the way to go. And you all are doing a fantastic job. So we want to congratulate you on doing that. And thank you so much once again for joining in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of the first session. We'll see you after a short break at 11:30. Kindly join us for the next one. We'll be talking about development of biomass energy, financing, designing, constructing, and operating. It's going to be an intense one. Join us at 11:30. Thank you so much.